Long before temples were carved into stone and gods were named in sacred texts, human hands painted mysteries onto cave walls, and voices whispered to unseen powers beneath the African sky. These were not the beginnings of religion as we know it. They were something older, more primal, more deeply connected to the rhythm of life itself. In the silence of prehistory, before dynasties and kings, deities were already being born in the heart of Africa. Africa is often celebrated as the cradle of humanity, the place where our species first took shape. But it is also the cradle of divinity, the birthplace of gods, rituals, and the very concept of the sacred. For centuries, historians have focused on Mesopotamia, Greece, or Egypt as the origins of religion. Yet beneath those layers lies an even older foundation, one carved into the memory of the earth itself, where the first seeds of divine archetypes sprouted. This hidden story has remained fragmented, buried in artifacts, oral traditions, and forgotten landscapes, waiting to be pieced together. Imagine Nabta Playa, a stone circle in the Nubian desert older than Stonehenge, aligned with the stars to mark seasons and sacred cycles. Or the haunting cave art of Tassili Najer in the Sahara, where figures dance in trance-like states, echoing shamanic rituals. These are not random expressions of art or survival. They are windows into the earliest human attempts to reach beyond the visible world. They hint at gods before names, spirits before scriptures, and an African cosmos teeming with meaning. But this is more than archaeology. It is a revelation about identity and legacy. When we look at the myths of Egypt, Osiris, Isis, Horus, we are not just looking at Egyptian creativity. We are witnessing the survival of ideas that reach further back in time. They inherited traits, symbols, and powers from earlier deities that stretched deep into Africa's prehistory. Even the thunderous gods of Greece, the storm-bearing Norse deities, and the watchful Abrahamic god carry shadows of ideas first shaped by African hands and African minds. These connections remind us that religion is not a static invention, but a flowing river with many tributaries that begin in Africa. For centuries, this truth was overshadowed. Western scholarship often dismissed Africa as a passive receiver of civilization, rather than its original architect. But archaeology, anthropology, and comparative mythology now tell a different story. They reveal that Africa was not only the birthplace of humanity, but also the forge where humanity's oldest spiritual blueprints were cast. The gods we know today are masks, behind which lie deeper faces that trace back to the ancestors of Africa. And these are not just relics of the past. They are alive in the rhythms of drum and dance, in the symbols carried across oceans during the African diaspora, and in the archetypes that still appear in the stories we tell today. The question is not whether these gods existed, it is how much of them survives in the myths, faiths, and symbols we take for granted. To study them is to reclaim a forgotten inheritance. This is the story we are about to unmask. A journey into the forgotten deities of pre-dynastic Africa, whose presence lingers in myths across the world. We will uncover how spirits of fertility became goddesses of creation, how ancestral reverence transformed into divine kingship, and how archetypes born in the cradle of Africa spread outward, shaping civilizations far beyond its borders. By the end, you will see the gods not as isolated inventions of different cultures, but as living echoes of a common spiritual origin that begins here, in Africa. Before the towering pyramids rose above the Nile, before pharaohs claimed divine right, there was a much older Africa, vast, untamed, and alive with spiritual meaning. This was a world not of palaces and hieroglyphs, but of open skies, sacred landscapes, and human communities learning to read the language of the earth and stars. To understand the roots of gods, we must first step back into this pre-dynastic age, when spirituality was not confined to temples, but lived in every stone, river, and breath of wind. Archaeologists call this period pre-dynastic, but that label hardly captures its richness. In truth, Africa's deep past stretches tens of thousands of years, marked by hunter-gatherer bands, early agricultural settlements, and societies that left no written records, but whose spiritual fingerprints endure. Evidence from rock art, burial practices, and sacred sites reveals that these early Africans were not only surviving, they were imagining, ritualizing, and connecting with forces beyond themselves. And in that connection, the earliest forms of gods began to emerge. Take Nabta Playa, a site in southern Egypt near the border of Nubia. Here, long before the dynasties, stones were carefully arranged into circles aligned with the stars, functioning as one of the world's earliest known astronomical observatories. Some of these structures date back nearly 7,000 years, predating Stonehenge by millennia. Yet Nabta Playa was more than a calendar. Its careful alignment with the rising of Sirius, the star that heralded the Nile's flooding, suggests that the people saw the heavens as intertwined with divine order. Imagine the scene, a community gathered under the desert sky, watching the star appear, knowing it meant life, renewal, and divine blessing. The stars were not cold lights in the sky. They were messengers of sacred cycles, and by aligning with them, humans were aligning with the gods. Further west, in the heart of the Sahara, lies Tassili Niger, a vast plateau covered in cave paintings and engravings. These images, some as old as 10,000 years, show masked figures with elongated limbs, animals depicted with reverence, and scenes of communal dancing that resemble trance rituals. Anthropologists interpret these as early expressions of shamanic spirituality, moments when humans sought to cross into other realms, guided by music, rhythm, and altered states of consciousness. In these caves, we glimpse the ancestors calling upon spirits, perhaps the prototypes of gods that later took on names and mythologies. The figures painted here could be the earliest depictions of divine beings, hybrid, otherworldly, mediators between humanity and the unseen. And yet, these were not isolated phenomena. Across Africa, burial sites testify to early spiritual systems. Graves with carefully placed goods, beads, tools, and ornaments suggest a belief in life after death. Some of the earliest burials, found in sites like Jebel Sahaba along the Nile, date back more than 13,000 years. These practices reflect more than mourning. They reveal the conviction that the human soul continued beyond the grave, watched over by forces larger than life itself. Death was not an end, but a passage, and those who guided it may have been among the earliest gods or divine ancestors. Even older symbols of the sacred come from Blombos Cave in South Africa, where pieces of ochre engraved with abstract designs date back more than 70,000 years. These markings are not random. They represent symbolic thought, the ability to connect meaning to patterns, to carve a language beyond words. Some scholars suggest these may have been used in ritual contexts, hinting at a spiritual awareness so ancient it reshapes how we think about human origins. Blombos reveals that Africa was imagining symbols of the sacred tens of thousands of years before the first written myth. Other sites, like the stone ruins sometimes called Adam's Calendar in southern Africa, spark debate among archaeologists. While controversial, they reflect a broader truth. Africa is dotted with ancient sites that speak to a long-standing human impulse to mark time, honor the cosmos, and connect with unseen powers. Whether every claim is accepted or not, the sheer density of sacred landscapes across Africa suggests that spirituality was not an invention of dynasties, but a continuous current flowing through the continent's earliest societies. What ties all these traditions together is their intimacy with nature. Pre-dynastic Africans did not build gods in their own image. Instead, they drew divinity out of rivers, mountains, storms, and animals. The crocodile was not just a predator, it was a guardian of waterways. The lion was not just a beast, it was an embodiment of strength, courage, and kingship. The cow, recurring in art and ritual, was more than food. It was a symbol of abundance and cosmic sustenance. These associations planted the seeds for later deities: Sobek, the crocodile god of the Nile; Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war; and Hathor, the cow goddess of fertility and joy. What dynasties named and formalized was already alive in the landscape, but it was not only animals and landscapes that carried divinity. Ancestors themselves were revered as bridges between the living and the unseen. In small villages scattered across the continent, people would call upon the spirits of those who came before, believing they could influence harvests, fertility, and protection. This reverence for ancestry did not fade, it evolved. In time, ancestors became gods, divine kings, or cosmic forces, remembered not only as family, but as embodiments of eternal power. This African tradition of ancestral veneration would ripple through history, resurfacing in countless religious systems worldwide. By piecing together these fragments, we see that Africa before dynasties was not a void waiting for civilization to arrive. It was already humming with sacred meaning, already experimenting with divine archetypes that would later solidify into pantheons. When dynastic Egypt rose, it did not invent gods out of thin air. It inherited a legacy of symbols, rituals, and archetypes that had been shaped for millennia by its African ancestors. The dynasties refined and named what was already alive in the land: the power of the sun, the fertility of the earth, the wisdom of the stars, and the voices of the ancestors. This truth challenges the way history is often told. Too often, the pre-dynastic world is dismissed as primitive, a vague prelude to the grandeur of pharaohs and pyramids. But when we look closely, we find that the so-called primitive was, in fact, profoundly sophisticated, aligning stone circles with constellations, carving ritual art into desert caves, burying the dead with sacred care. These acts reveal minds deeply attuned to the cosmos and the mystery of existence. They reveal the birth of gods. And so, Africa before dynasties was not an empty stage waiting for history's play to begin. It was the original theater of divinity, where the first sacred dramas unfolded under open skies. Every later religion, every myth of gods descending, kings ruling by divine right, or stars guiding destiny, carries within it an echo of this beginning. If we are to unmask the deities of history, we must first honor these roots, the roots planted in the soil of Africa long before the word God was ever spoken. If the sacred landscapes of Africa were the stage, then the first deities were the actors stepping onto it. Long before dynastic Egypt, long before the names of Isis or Osiris were inscribed in stone, humanity had already begun giving form to the unseen. These early deities were not written in scriptures or carved into temples. They lived in the minds of communities, in rituals passed down through generations, and in the symbols carried on tools, bones, and cave walls. To uncover them, we must look at the recurring figures that appear across early African traditions: the mother, the animal, the ancestor, and the shapeshifter. Each represents one of the earliest faces of godhood, primal archetypes that later civilizations would refine, rename, and worship. The most ancient and universal figure was the mother. Across prehistoric Africa, fertility was life itself. Without crops, animals, and childbirth, there could be no survival. It is no surprise, then, that one of the first divine archetypes was a feminine presence linked to fertility, nourishment, and creation. Archaeologists have discovered figurines across early settlements, often depicting exaggerated hips and breasts. These were not artistic accidents. They were symbols of abundance, protectors of fertility, and the first echoes of goddesses who would later appear across civilizations. From these early mother figures came the seeds of later deities: Hathor in Egypt, the nurturing cow goddess; Isis, the divine mother who resurrects life; and echoes in Greek and Roman goddesses like Demeter and Venus. The archetype of the mother began in Africa, and her presence can be traced across continents. But fertility was more than a maternal symbol. It was cosmic. Cattle, central to many African societies, were not only wealth, but sacred beings embodying nourishment and cosmic sustenance. This reverence birthed horned goddess figures such as Bat, later merging into Hathor, whose cow horns framed the solar disk. The horned goddess is one of humanity's oldest divine images, and her African roots stretch deep into pre-dynastic times. The association of horns with the crescent moon and the cycles of fertility reveals a profound connection between earthly survival and celestial rhythms. Even today, among the Dinka of South Sudan and the Maasai of Kenya, cattle remain tied to spiritual identity, echoing traditions thousands of years old. Alongside the mother emerged the animal spirits, the wild forces of nature personified. To early Africans, animals were not just creatures, they were vessels of divine power. The crocodile was feared and revered, its strength tied to the waters of the Nile and surrounding rivers. The lion embodied courage, ferocity, and kingship. The serpent, shedding its skin, symbolized rebirth and hidden wisdom. In West Africa, the python was sacred, representing the bridge between earth and the underworld. In Nubia, baboons were seen as messengers of the sun, their cries at dawn interpreted as hymns of cosmic order. These associations found new life in Egyptian deities such as Sobek, the crocodile god of the Nile, Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war, and Thoth, often depicted as an ibis or baboon. To honor the animal was to honor the divine principle it embodied. This fusion of animal and God reveals how Africans understood divinity as inseparable from the natural world. The ancestor archetype was equally foundational. Unlike the distant gods of later pantheons, these were spirits rooted in lineage, memory, and community. Across Africa, ancestral veneration has always been central, linking the living with the dead and binding society to unseen forces. The ancestors were guardians, mediators, and enforcers of moral order. They blessed harvests, guided decisions, and protected families. Over time, these ancestral spirits evolved into full-fledged deities. In Egypt, this tradition crystallized into divine kingship. The pharaoh, considered a living god, joined the ancestors upon death, continuing to rule in the afterlife. But this was not unique to Egypt. The idea of divine ancestry rippled outward, in Greek hero cults where mortals became semi-divine, in Roman veneration of household spirits, and in Chinese ancestor traditions. Even in the African diaspora, through Vodun, Santeria, and Candomblé, the honoring of ancestors remains a central ritual, demonstrating the continuity of Africa's earliest gods across oceans and centuries. Yet the earliest deities also presided over death. In African burials, red ochre was often sprinkled on bodies, tools and ornaments were placed with the deceased, and graves were aligned with celestial patterns. These practices suggest belief in divine forces overseeing the soul's journey beyond death. In Egypt, this evolved into Osiris, the lord of the afterlife, who judged the dead and promised resurrection. But the prototype of Osiris likely lay in older, unnamed spirits of pre-dynastic Africa, guardians of passage, who ensured that life extended beyond the grave. The continuity between these early practices and later funerary religions shows that the fear and mystery of death was always intertwined with the making of gods. And then there were the shapeshifters, hybrid beings part human, part animal, glimpsed in cave art and artifacts. At Tassili Niger, some figures appear with antelope heads, bird-like features, or elongated forms, suggesting beings who move between worlds. These were not artistic curiosities, but visions of divine intermediaries. Later, Egyptian gods like Anubis, with the head of a jackal, and Horus, with the head of a falcon, carried this archetype forward. But the shapeshifter is older than Egypt. Its echoes appear globally. In Mesopotamian winged deities, in Greek satyrs and centaurs, in Norse animal spirits. But the earliest visual records trace back to Africa's caves and rock shelters. These beings embodied the mystery that divinity was not fixed, not bound to human form, but fluid, liminal, and transformative. Taken together, these archetypes, the mother, the animal, the ancestor, the shapeshifter, formed the spiritual DNA of later pantheons. They were the primal deities, unnamed yet deeply present, from whom countless gods would descend. What we see in dynastic Egypt and later in Mesopotamia, Greece, and beyond is not the invention of gods but their evolution. The seeds were sown in pre-dynastic Africa, in rituals beneath starry skies, in the memory of ancestors, and in the reverence of nature. The gods of the world are branches. The roots are here. And this recognition changes everything. The divine mother who nurtures, the animal who embodies power, the ancestor who guides, the shapeshifter who bridges worlds. These are not random inventions of isolated cultures. They are recurring archetypes, born in Africa and carried outward through migration, cultural exchange, and the universal search for meaning. They remind us that gods are not only products of imagination. They are reflections of humanity's deepest desires, fears, and hopes. And in Africa, those reflections first took shape, unmasked in their primal form. By the time dynastic Egypt began to rise along the Nile, Africa already held centuries, if not millennia, of spiritual experimentation. The gods were not inventions of kings or priests. They were inheritances, polished and reshaped from the raw archetypes of prehistory. What dynasties did was codify them, carve their names into stone, and organize them into pantheons that could rule as much as protect. The blueprint for civilization itself was drawn on the canvas of divine order. The transition from village spirits to state gods was not sudden. It was a process of layering. Fertility goddesses, once embodied by small figurines and sacred cattle, evolved into Hathor, the radiant lady of heaven, patron of music, joy, and motherhood. Ancestral guardians, once invoked around fire-lit rituals, became Osiris, king of the dead, and his consort Isis, whose magic restored life. The animal spirits grew into full deities: Sobek, crocodile lord of the Nile's power; Horus, falcon-eyed protector of kingship; Sekhmet, lioness of fire and war. These gods were not new creations but refinements of archetypes already etched into the African imagination. And here lies the brilliance of Africa's spiritual blueprint. The gods were not abstract concepts. They were reflections of cosmic principles. The Nile's flooding was not only a natural event, it was the heartbeat of divine order, tied to the star Sirius and the cycles of the heavens. Kingship was not only political power, it was divine inheritance, with the pharaoh seen as Horus in life and Osiris in death. Every aspect of existence, birth, love, war, harvest, death, was placed within a sacred framework. To live was to participate in divine drama, and to rule was to embody it. What Egypt accomplished was monumental. It turned the scattered archetypes of prehistory into a system that could sustain a civilization. The gods became not only figures of reverence but instruments of unity. Temples rose as cosmic centers, where rituals synchronized human life with divine order. Priests became interpreters of the unseen, their hieroglyphs binding memory into permanence. And while Egypt's gods were its own, their forms carried echoes recognizable to countless cultures. Consider the archetype of the dying and rising god. Osiris, murdered, dismembered, and resurrected by Isis, presides over death yet promises rebirth. This story resonates far beyond the Nile. In Mesopotamia, Tammuz and Inanna echo the cycle. In Greece, Dionysus and Persephone embody similar themes. In Christianity, the crucified and resurrected Christ reflects the same divine pattern. All share the African blueprint: the God who dies so that life continues, the eternal promise that endings are beginnings. Or take the mother goddess. In Egypt, Hathor and Isis embody nurture, love, and divine protection. In Mesopotamia, Ishtar takes the role. In Greece, Demeter and Aphrodite. In Rome, Venus. Across Africa, in Yoruba traditions, ocean flows with the same waters of fertility and love. The archetype radiates outward like ripples, always rooted in the primal mother first shaped in African hands. Even the pantheon itself, the idea of multiple gods embodying natural and cosmic forces, was carried outward. Greek Olympians, Norse Aesir, Hindu divas, all echo a system first formalized in Africa. A sky father, a mother goddess, a god of storms, a lord of the underworld, tricksters, healers, creators, destroyers. These roles were already rehearsed in Africa's early deities, waiting to be recast in new cultural theaters. The blueprint of the pantheon was one of Africa's greatest gifts to human imagination. But Africa's influence did not stop with mythology. It shaped philosophy. Egyptian concepts such as Ma'at, truth, balance, justice, cosmic harmony, became the foundation of ethics, governance, and spirituality. Ma'at was more than a goddess. She was the principle by which the universe was held together. Later civilizations, too, would build philosophies of balance and justice. The Greek idea of logos, the Chinese Tao, the Christian concept of divine order. Each echoes Ma'at, the African principle of balance that predates them all. And then there is the archetype of kingship. In Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely a ruler but a living god, Horus incarnate. His death was not an end but a transformation, joining the divine ancestors as Osiris. This sacred kingship inspired models across time. In Mesopotamia, rulers claimed divine mandate. In medieval Europe, kings ruled by the grace of God. In Asia, emperors held the mandate of heaven. The idea that power descends from the divine traces back to Africa, where kingship was sacred long before it was political. We begin to see then that the gods of later civilizations, Zeus, Odin, Yahweh, Vishnu, are not isolated inventions but reinterpretations of an African grammar of divinity. The blueprint is consistent: fertility, death, rebirth, kingship, cosmic balance, ancestor worship, nature spirits. These were Africa's original contributions, and once carried into structured religions, they became the backbone of world mythology. Yet while Egypt stands as the most famous custodian of this blueprint, it was not alone. Nubia, Kush, Ethiopia, and West Africa all nurtured their own divine systems, many of which interwove with Egyptian religion. Nubian gods like Apetamak, the lion-headed war deity, or Amun of Thebes, who rose from Nubian roots to become one of Egypt's greatest gods, show how divine archetypes traveled and transformed within Africa itself. In Yoruba cosmology, the Orishas reflect similar archetypes: Ogun, the warrior; Shango, the thunderer; Yemoja, the mother of waters. These were not late inventions, but parallel expressions of the same ancient blueprint, shaped differently by environment, culture, and time. What is striking is how resilient these archetypes are. Even when empires fell, even when religions shifted, the blueprints endured. Christianity absorbed the Mother into the Virgin Mary, the resurrected God into Christ, the saints into ancestral mediators. Islam, while fiercely monotheistic, preserved the African reverence for memory and lineage, embedding it in traditions of honoring ancestors and spiritual guides. Even in modern storytelling, films, and literature, the archetypes return: the nurturing mother, the trickster, the reborn hero, the god of storms. These are not simply stories, they are the enduring architecture of the human soul, drafted first in Africa. The gods of Africa were not confined to Africa. They became the DNA of divine imagination, carried across continents, adopted, reshaped, and renamed. And through this transmission, Africa gave the world more than civilization. It gave the world its gods. As civilizations rose and fell, the gods of Africa did not vanish. They adapted, transformed, and often went underground, hidden beneath the weight of conquest and the spread of new religions. To trace their survival is to witness a remarkable story of resilience, how deities could be suppressed by power yet continue to live in memory, symbol, and ritual. The first wave of transformation came with Egypt itself. As dynasties expanded, local deities were absorbed into larger pantheons, rebranded or merged with more dominant gods. Minor spirits became aspects of greater deities. Village protectors became cosmic figures. This process of syncretism, blending gods together, preserved much while also erasing the uniqueness of older traditions. The Nubian lion god at Pre-Dynastic, for example, would eventually be overshadowed by Amun and Ra. Yet the archetype of the warrior, the sun, and the lion endured, carried forward under new names. Suppression here was subtle, not destruction but assimilation, a rewriting of the divine genealogy. The greater suppression came with foreign conquest. When Greece and Rome entered Egypt, they absorbed the gods into their own systems. Isis, once the divine mother of Africa, became a goddess worshipped across the Mediterranean, her cult spreading as far as Rome and Britain. Osiris, god of resurrection, found echoes in Dionysus and Serapis, a Greco-Egyptian hybrid deity. To many, this might look like cultural theft, but it also meant continuity. The African gods survived by wearing new masks, their essence preserved even as their names changed. But with the spread of Christianity and later Islam, the suppression became sharper. These faiths, rooted in Abrahamic monotheism, sought to eliminate polytheistic worship. African deities were recast as demons, their sacred rituals dismissed as superstition. Temples were destroyed, and ancient practices were banned. Yet history shows that gods do not die easily. In Egypt, the mother goddess re-emerged in the veneration of Mary, mother of Christ. The rituals of Osiris lived on in Christian imagery of resurrection and eternal life. The African blueprint could not be erased. It resurfaced within the very faiths meant to replace it. Colonialism brought yet another wave of suppression. As European powers spread across Africa, they dismissed indigenous religions as pagan and imposed Christianity by force. Priests and missionaries cut down sacred groves, outlawed ancestral rituals, and attempted to sever communities from their spiritual heritage. Yet once again, the gods adapted. In West Africa and the Caribbean, enslaved Africans carried their deities across the ocean. Forbidden to openly worship them, they disguised their gods as Catholic saints. The thunder god Shango became associated with Saint Barbara. The mother of waters, Yemoja, was hidden beneath the Virgin Mary. The Orishas of Yoruba survived in Santeria, Vodun, and Candomblé, not as relics, but as living gods, speaking in new tongues. Suppression had forced the gods to transform, but in transformation they endured. This hidden survival reveals something profound. The gods of Africa were never truly defeated. They were rebranded, renamed, and reimagined, but their essence flowed through every new mask. Even in the diaspora, where chains sought to erase culture, the gods whispered in drumbeats, dances, and chants. They lived in memory, in ritual, in the invisible space between human longing and divine presence. To trace their survival is to see resilience itself, the refusal of spirit to be silenced. And even today, the echoes continue. In modern Africa, traditional religions coexist with Christianity and Islam, their deities invoked in ceremonies, festivals, and daily life. In the diaspora, Orisha worship thrives in cities across the Americas. In art, music, and literature, African gods re-emerge, retelling ancient stories in new forms. They have moved from temples to popular culture, from sacred groves to global consciousness. The suppression never destroyed them. It only made them more adaptable, more enduring. The story of suppression and transformation is not just about religion, it is about identity. To erase the gods was to erase memory, heritage, and power. Yet their survival shows that memory cannot be fully erased, only buried. When the gods reappear, they bring with them the voices of ancestors, the rhythms of ancient rituals, and the unbroken chain of African imagination. They remind us that the divine is not static, but living, capable of shifting, surviving, and speaking anew in every age. And so, when we look at the gods of today, in churches, mosques, or hidden shrines, we see more than isolated traditions. We see a tapestry woven from ancient threads, African threads that continue to shape the spiritual story of humanity. Suppression could not end them, it only proved their immortality. From the deserts of Nabta Playa to the painted caves of Tassili Najer, from the sacred cattle of pre-dynastic villages to the mighty pantheon of Egypt, one truth resounds. Africa was not only the cradle of humanity, but the birthplace of divinity itself. The gods we think of as Greek, Roman, or even Abrahamic carry within them echoes of older voices, voices first spoken beneath African skies. We have unmasked the archetypes, the mother who nurtures and sustains, the animal spirit who embodies the powers of nature, the ancestor who bridges the living and the dead, the shapeshifter who traverses worlds. We have traced their transformation into structured pantheons, their echoes in global religions, and their survival against centuries of suppression. Again and again, they remind us that gods do not die. They change, they adapt, they wear new masks, but their essence remains. This realization reshapes the way we see history. Africa was not a silent backdrop to civilization, it was its architect. The divine principles of balance, kingship, fertility, and resurrection, concepts that became the bedrock of human spirituality, were already alive in Africa long before dynasties etched them in stone. To recognize this is to restore Africa to its rightful place at the heart of the world's spiritual heritage. And today, these gods continue to live. They live in the orishas called upon in diaspora rituals. They live in the ancestral shrines of African villages. They live in the stories, symbols, and archetypes that shape our films, novels, and dreams. Whether we recognize it or not, humanity still walks with the gods of Africa. So when we speak of Zeus or Osiris, Christ or Krishna, we are also speaking, in fragments and reflections, of deities whose roots reach back to Africa's earliest sacred landscapes. To unmask them is not to diminish their power, but to honor their origin. It is to see the hidden threads that bind human spirituality into one story, a story that begins in Africa. And this story is not finished. It is alive in every drumbeat, every prayer, every symbol that carries forward the ancient memory of the first gods. To learn it is to reclaim a piece of ourselves. To share it is to ensure that these voices once suppressed are heard again. If this journey has opened your eyes to the hidden roots of divinity, then carry it forward. Share this video so others can unmask the forgotten gods. Like it to keep the rhythm alive, and subscribe so we can continue exploring the mysteries of history, myth, and the enduring power of spirit. The gods have never left us, and together we can keep their story alive.